episode of Treasures of the Holy Quran. We've been doing this series for a few weeks now, and the purpose is just to delve deeper into the Holy Quran, understand it, and make it something applicable to our lives so that we really truly understand the value of it. And just last week, Hazur Ayatollah bin Nasr Aziz delivered his Friday sermon, of course, on the excellences and and the status of the Holy Quran. So we have a lot of momentum coming into this, as Khalifatul Masih Ayatollah bin Nasr Aziz brought attention to how important the Holy Quran is, and that essentially by obeying the commandments of the Holy Quran, by building a relationship with it, this is how we cultivate a relationship with Allah Almighty, essentially, and save ourselves from salvation. The Holy Quran is a living book that we have. And if we don't build that relationship with Allah Almighty, with the Holy Quran, and try to understand it, then we can never really truly even understand Allah Almighty Himself. So this week, we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of talking about specific verses, we'll talk about another subject that has to do with the Holy Quran, is very deeply connected, and that is the attributes of Allah Almighty. Those of us who hopefully read the Holy Quran, or we read the translation, then we know, of course, that throughout the Holy Quran, Allah Almighty mentions His attributes, a number of them, in various places: the forgiving, the merciful, the compassionate, the punisher, wrathful, etc., what have you. And we want to go into this and really understand what is the wisdom behind this, what does it mean, and kind of realize how this actually unpacks the Holy Quran for us. We might read it in translation kind of nonchalantly. We just see this as, okay, Allah Almighty is describing Himself. But really, there's a deep wisdom behind it. And we should know the importance and
Well, this up, can you just unmute yourself? I think you just got muted for a second.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, it's good now.
Apologies. Yeah. We have Murabbi Rizwan with us here again this week. Just to carry on our conversation on this topic. Murabbi Sahab, why do we actually even need to know about the attributes of Allah Almighty? Allah Ta'ala mentions them again and again, over and over again. What's the greater wisdom behind it?
No, there's one answer that Hazrat Muslim Maud Raziyallahu anhu gave. I think it was in Taluk Billah, where he explained that when we get to know a person, we learn about their attributes and their characteristics later. The first thing we see is their face, their appearance, what we see on the outside. But with Allah Ta'ala, it's the opposite. That first we see His attributes, and then we see His actual beauty. So with a human being, we see their beauty first, or what we can observe, and then we see what's inside. So with Allah Almighty, if we don't actually know His attributes, His characteristics, then just the name of Allah is not going to bring a picture or some recognition to our mind. It's going to be like hearing the name of somebody who you never even met before. Like if you don't know somebody named Zaid, if somebody mentions the name Zaid, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to bring a memory. It's not going to create an emotion. But if we have a very close friend or a family member named Zaid, then when we hear that name, it brings a flood of memories, of thoughts, and of emotions and things like that. So with Allah Almighty, if we don't know His attributes, His qualities, His characteristics, then the word Allah is not actually going to mean anything to us. So the only way we can get to know Him is through His characteristics. So when we learn the attributes of Allah Almighty, His actions, then that name of Allah starts to bring a picture of someone we know. Then when we hear Allah, we recognize that, oh, that's the person. The same way we look at somebody's face, we immediately recognize that's that person, and we think of all their characteristics. So when we think of all the characteristics of Allah Almighty, then a type of picture comes in our mind that this is who Allah is, and it's someone who we're familiar with. So that's why it's really important to learn the attributes of Allah Almighty and His names.
I remember, Muslim he just explains it very, very simply, that look, the purpose of our lives is to ultimately find Allah Almighty, build a relationship with Him. He said, in the same way, if I was to describe to you someone that you need to go find, then I would say that, okay, there's this person, his name is Adil, he's wearing a gray sweater, he has a black topi on, he's wearing this color pants, he has a beard, etc. So I would describe the features of that person and then tell you, go and search for this individual. So I thought that's a very nice, simple description. Allah Almighty describes himself that he is such in this way, he has this attribute, so that we can begin to see those attributes. We can see how he functions and how the world works. And this means that we need to reflect over the Holy Quran, we need to reflect over the creation, we need to reflect over our lives. And in it, we kind of will see the signs of Allah Almighty, we will see his attributes, and we kind of piece it together, and we'll be able to go on this journey of discovering him. So just to get into the discussion of a couple of attributes, just so we kind of know how deep of a subject this is. Out of the many attributes that we read in the Holy Quran, where we saw one of those attributes is Al-Aziz, repeated multiple times. Usually we translate it as the mighty or the honorable. So what can you tell us about this attribute? What does it reveal about Allah?
One thing that helps, it helps in any language, it helps in English as well, that when we know what the opposite of a word is, its antonym, then it makes it easier to understand what that word means itself. So the word Aziz by itself, its antonym is the word Zalil. And it's not really that Urdu meaning of Zalil, although like in Urdu, Zalil is very close to the Arabic meaning. When we think of Zalil in Urdu, we think of disgraced. But in Arabic, Zalil has both meanings of weakness and of disgrace. It has a meaning of Zaif, which is the opposite of Qawi. And also it has a meaning of, muhino manirada ihanatika, that Ilham was in Masih Maud Islam. It has a meaning of disgrace or humiliation. So Zalil, when we think, it kind of refers to that, one thing that we can picture is the humiliation that comes with being conquered and overpowered. Any nation, any people, when they experience that, there's a unique disgrace that's involved there in that weakness. There's a fall from grace and dignity and respect that comes with that weakness and of being overpowered. So the opposite of that is Aziz. Aziz is the honor and the respect that comes with being a mighty and strong person who's able to dominate and conquer others. But again, that meaning of respect is there. It's not like a bully just overcomes somebody else, or like a dictator just conquers their neighboring countries without any reason. That person is not Aziz in this because he doesn't have respect. He doesn't inspire respect in the hearts of people. In fact, they inspire disdain and hatred. So Aziz brings those two meanings together of quwwat, of strength, of ghalba and qahir, the one who dominates and overwhelms, and also of izzat, of honor and dignity and nobility.
Yeah, I think it's we just hear this one description of this attribute of Allah Almighty, and it's very vivid. It paints a whole picture, and it's just interesting how just this one word kind of puts you more in the awe of Allah Almighty. So if we just kind of extrapolate it, just think about if we go into the meanings of the other attributes, what it can mean. And one thing that I wanted to bring up is, a lot of things get lost in translation. We read the translation of a lot of these attributes, and many of them have similar meanings. We might hear, okay, he's the mighty and the powerful, or he's compassionate, he's merciful. Another combination is he's all-knowing and all-aware. When we read this in translation, we're just like, okay, it's just not the, just two similar words. But of course, Allah Almighty specifically uses different attributes and different words. And it's interesting to see how, even though they're similar, there's these slight subtle differences that reveal even more. So, one interesting example that we want to cover is Ar-Rauf and Ar-Rahim, one of the examples. So the translation, you'll go over is Rauf, usually as compassionate, Rahim as merciful. Again, we would think, okay, same words, not that big of a difference. But what is the difference? But just between these words, why are they used by Allah?
Yeah, one reason for a lot of those difficulties is just things getting lost in translation. It's because English doesn't have that root system. And so it's not as easy to just go into the origins of the word and really clearly define what is the distinction between these two synonymous words. So, like you mentioned, with Ra'uf and Rahim, sometimes they're both translated as the compassionate. Under Ar-Rahim, the one translation will be the merciful and the compassionate. And then under Ra'uf, it'll be the compassionate and some other synonymous words. And then also, like you mentioned, Ilm and Khabar, Alim and Khabir, the one who is all knowing and all aware. Now, those are two English words that are used, but then, if we don't really know what the Arabic word is and what the root meanings are, if we try to figure out what the difference is between knowledge and awareness based on English, we're going to end up getting lost. We're going to end up getting confused. So with a lot of these synonymous names, one point that Hazrat Muslim Maud made in the Bacha Tafsir al-Quran is that there are no two names that are perfectly synonymous. There's always something that is being conveyed differently in each of those names. And just as a very short answer, when it comes to Ar-Ra'uf or-Rahim, there in Tafsir Kabir, as Muslim Maud explained that Rahim has to do with the mercy and the love that we feel in any situation, positive, negative, happiness, sadness, all those things. Ra'uf has to do with that feeling of pity that arises in our heart when we see someone in suffering. The English word of pity is not something that we talk about when somebody is happy. So mercy, rahmat, rahim is something you can have on someone when they're happy. Even when we get rewarded, we pray that Allah Ta'ala have more rahmat and be more rahim to us by giving us more and more rewards. But when we're happy, we don't see Allah Ta'ala have pity on us by giving us more and more pity. So pity has to do more as a reaction to pain and suffering. When we see somebody in hardship, then that brings ra'fat, that ra'fa and from within our hearts. So ra'uf has to do specifically with, when we're in pain and suffering, then we say, Ya Ra'uf, oh, the compassionate and the one who gives more pity than anyone else, that have pity on me and have mercy on me in this situation. So that's a distinction between Ra'uf and Rahim, and that's one of the names of Allah Almighty that's mentioned in the second part, actually right at the beginning of the second para, the second part of the Holy Quran.
What's interesting to me is right now we've just kind of barely covered three attributes. We kind of brush on a surface level, yet just the discussion of these three attributes themselves, we can go on for 15-20 minutes, and then you think about, okay, well, if you take all the other attributes of Allah Almighty, how long it would take to really unpack who Allah Almighty is. And throughout, as we're growing up, we always hear this expression that the Holy Quran is an endless treasure. The Holy Quran is infinite in what it can offer. And sometimes when we begin to unpack these attributes of Allah Almighty, the sensitivity of the differences, then it really begins to set in your mind just how kind of vast Allah Almighty is. And it shows the power of the Holy Quran. It shows the power of Allah Almighty.
Yeah.
That if we just spend our time going through each of these attributes, reflecting on them, thinking what they mean, then it literally is a lifelong journey. There's no end in sight. In really trying to figure out how Allah Almighty is. It really brings the Holy Quran, establishes its power in your life.
Yeah, and one way that I feel like it makes it easier to apply it, because it might be overwhelming at first that, okay, like how am I going to reflect on the theological nature of these names of God? But a lot of them, if we just apply them to a parent-child relationship, that makes it a lot easier. For example, Ra'uf, the one who pities. We see that when a child falls down, when he or she gets hurt, the first thing they do is they look to their parents because they want pity. And sometimes they'll exaggerate that feeling of pain and the suffering they're in just because there's so much comfort in getting pity from their parents. So that's something that each of us can connect with. So anytime we go through any type of suffering or hardship, if then we have that addiction the way a child does to just wanting to get pity from their parents, so we would want to get pity from Allah Almighty, then we can see how that kind of relationship of love and that sort of helplessness of a child is expressed in our relationship with Allah Almighty. And that also applies with the attribute of Al-Aziz as well, to a certain extent, if we think of it as in a parent-child relationship. Aziz is a use of strength and might that inspires respect. So a good parent is one who doesn't have to demand respect from their children. And this is what we see with the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Their children, they had the highest level of respect for them. They would listen to everything their parents said. They respected the authority of their parents. But it wasn't because their parents were like tyrannical, they would beat them or anything like that, but their parents inspired a respect. So it was a combination of that, that superior strength and might that a parent has over their child, combined with that respect that they inspire in the heart of the child, that really makes, that kind of gives us an analogy. So I think, in like these parent-child relationships, and then thinking of how these attributes can apply there, then a lot of the attributes can be a lot easier to understand there.
Definitely. I think it's kind of scary, as has been mentioned, to think about, just how long you can go on the subject. But I think if we humanize it a little bit, try to connect ourselves with seeing those attributes inside of us, then we can really begin to understand just how grand Allah Almighty is. Another attribute in the Holy Quran that we see again and again mentioned a number of times is the attribute of Al Hakim. Just kind of one more attribute to cover for today, meaning the all wise. Generally, that's how we translate it. But again, what are the deeper meanings of this? What can we take from it?
So Hakim, it comes from the word of hikmah, which is wisdom, and it basically means having knowledge and then acting according to that knowledge. So this is kind of connected with two different attributes of Allah Almighty. One is ilm, al-alim, but alim just has to do with knowledge. It doesn't have to do with action. But al-hakim has to do with acting exactly according to that perfect knowledge. So this is why the name also comes from the same root as the name al-hakam, the judge. So Al-Hakam is the one who judges, who makes decisions, who gives commands, and his actions are according to his perfect knowledge and wisdom. And there's just a very simple analogy I want to give that I think helps us to understand it. And it doesn't have to do with wisdom. It has to do with how, we can even see in artificial intelligence that superior knowledge is something that makes us respect the decision-making power of an inanimate artificial intelligence. Now, a few months ago, there was this whole scandal about cheating in chess. And how do you determine if someone's cheating? Because the whole thing is that they're basically using an AI. They're playing chess on their computer. They're using an AI over here. They're getting the computer to tell them what to do. So how do you tell what's the difference between a human move and an AI move? Well, the thing is that a human, even the grandmaster, is at the best they can think maybe 8 moves in advance. But an AI is able to do, so many computations. They can think way more moves in advance. So the difference between a human and an AI is that since a human can't see that far ahead, the human usually will never sacrifice certain pieces and make certain moves that would be reckless when you look forward only 8 moves. A human would never, for example, sacrifice a queen. But an AI, since it's looking 50, 100, whatever that number of moves is, it'll see that if I sacrifice the queen right here, then this many turns ahead, I'll get a checkmate guaranteed. And so it'll make that move that only an AI is able to see. And the thing is that somebody who's cheating and they have the AI sitting there telling them what to do, when it tells them sacrifice this queen, even though it goes against the principles of chess, even though it seems like it's a suicidal thing to do, but they'll blindly follow because they trust that this AI knows better than I do. It has superior knowledge, and it's telling me to make a decision based on that superior knowledge. So that's just an example. We would never call an AI as wise because wisdom has a very different definition. It has to do with more profound things like the pursuit of happiness, with religion and things like that. But still, that same principle applies even in something like this, that when we accept that someone or even something has greater knowledge than we do, then we'll even follow it in the decisions that it's telling us to make that seem harmful for us. So by that, we can understand that when a human being, for example, that we respect has more wisdom than us, then we'll follow their advice, even if we don't understand it, even if it seems harmful initially. And that applies all the more to Allah Almighty, that when we realize and when we have yaqeen through experience that Allah Almighty's knowledge is perfect, then when he tells us to do something, even if it seems harmful in the short term, but we have that understanding and that yaqeen and that knowledge and that at least faith that ultimately it's going to be for the best. So that's kind of a way of understanding what hikmat is and how it applies to Allah Almighty being Al-Hakim.
Jazakallah. I mean, the example that you mentioned of Alim and Hakim, the subtle differences, like we've been saying, on the surface level, it just seems like it's the same, but when you delve deeper, then it opens up different layers of Allah Almighty, and it's our task to appreciate each of those. Now, Hakim is repeated a number of times in the Holy Quran, and something that's pretty interesting that we've all probably noticed in kind of the construction of some of the sentences of the Quran, but maybe we never really gave it a second thought, is that a lot of these attributes come at the end of certain verses, right? Sometimes we come across these, 2-word attribute combinations. For example, Alim and Hakim or Khabir and Latif. These often come at the end of verses. And Hazrat Muslim anhu, he says something really interesting, that these verses, when you have these attributes that come at the end, they are like a key to that verse. We have to think about those attributes, and it makes us understand that verse. They're like a qualifier. And I was just thinking, like in an emergency situation, if you're in a critical situation, or there's people gathered around, they don't know what to do, and a doctor shows up, right? They would say, I'm a doctor, I'm a doctor. They would qualify their ability to kind of carry out something. Or if there's a, you know, some kind of debate happening, maybe it's a debate on you know, laws or something, and someone in that group says that I'm a lawyer, I'm trained in this, then we would all kind of go quiet and defer to what that person is saying. They're backing up what they're saying. So these attributes of Allah Almighty, when he mentions them at the end of these verses, it's kind of like Allah Almighty is backing up what he's saying. That if there's a commandment, for example, all the different teachings and all the different commandments that Allah Almighty gives us, then, and if we want to know that, you know, what's the greater push behind it, you can say it's those attributes that he will say, that the reason why this teaching or this commandment, this instruction is valid is because Allah Almighty is a certain way. He backs himself up by mentioning certain attributes.
Yeah, and especially, you know, in the part that we're covering in Surah Al-Baqarah, there's a lot of different commandments that come, and we see in a lot of those, for example, Al-Aziz Al-Hakim is mentioned. And there, you know, it gives us a reminder that these are two reasons why we follow any kind of commandment. For example, if the government, if the law says you have to do this, whether we agree with it or whether we understand it or not, we're going to follow it because we fear the authority of that government. We respect the authority. There's some roads that have a speed limit that's so low that we disagree. We think that this is just absurd. But still, we go on that speed limit because we know that the government has authority. It has the strength to impose those rules, and they can put us in jail if they want to. So Al-Aziz reminds us of that the one who's giving these commandments, he is the one who has might, and also he has strength. He can conquer, he can overwhelm, he can make a person helpless. But on the other hand, it also tells us that Allah Almighty is not a dictator. He's not someone who just, you know, oppresses people or anything like that. He's the one who is Al-Hakim. All of those rules and all those laws, they're based on a deep wisdom that are there for our benefit. And when we deviate from them, we hurt ourselves. So that's kind of, you know, what we see, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, that a lot of those verses where these two names of Allah come at the end, then that's kind of a reminder for us that when someone in this world who you consider to be Aziz and Hakim, you follow those rules. You always follow those rules without fail. In fact, even if people only have one of these names, if they only have power and they have no wisdom, even then you'll follow it. So here Allah Ta'ala is saying that when your God is the one who is the perfect Aziz, the mighty and the honorable, and also Hakim, the all-knowing, the all-wise, then there's no reason not to follow those commandments. And there's no reason to, you know, resist or to disobey them.
Yeah, I mean, just an example. I think you went over how in verses where Allah Almighty commands men, He mentions Aziz at the end. So you know, that was a very interesting example. If you could just, you know, just very briefly mention that, because I think it's very enlightening.
Yeah, because, you know, a lot of the verses, you know, especially in Tafsir al-Kabir, Hazrat Muslim Maud, you know, explained why these verses are mentioned. And, you know, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, there's verses about the different roles of men and women. And there, at the end of some of those verses, these two names are mentioned. And he explained that Al-Aziz is to remind men that although you've been made stronger than women in some ways, but there is someone who is stronger than you as well. So if you abuse this power, then you might be Aziz in certain ways, but there is an Al-Aziz who you will have to face afterwards. And whatever extent to which you use that power to oppress and to overwhelm or do any of those things, that God who is Al-Aziz has greater power to punish you for that. And then also when Allah Ta'ala says Al-Hakim, He reminds women that while Allah Ta'ala has created a social order and a system where men have been given certain responsibilities and in certain places they're placed in a position of leadership, but it is based on wisdom. It is based on His being Al-Hakim. And when we deviate from that wisdom, then all of society starts to suffer. So both of those attributes are there as a reminder for each group of people who are addressed to give them a very specific sort of antidote that needs to be given for a certain question or an objection that might arise in the mind. And then also, you know, it's not just about men and women, but in Surah Al-Baqarah, we see that there's so many different commandments related to inheritance, related to finances, related to, you know, all these things, social issues, societal issues. And in each of those cases, you know, all of these names of Allah Almighty, when they're mentioned at the end of the verse, they kind of act as a reminder that these are the relevant names of Allah Almighty that are being manifested here. And these are the relevant names of Allah that will answer any questions that arise in your mind about Allah Almighty in relation to these commandments that He gave.
Yeah, I think, you know, just a small example that you gave, for example, of the usage of Aziz and Hakim, it kind of shows just with one word, how the Holy Quran gives guidance. Literally, just Allah Ta'ala just says this one word and it unpacks so much for us. So, just think about the rest of the Holy Quran, all the other moments where these attributes are used. It can just unfold so many messages for us if we just sort of contemplate and think about why Allah Ta'ala is specifically using these attributes in these occasions. And it shows that the Holy Quran is a live book, that Allah Almighty Himself is, quote, alive, meaning that He's aware of our psyche, He knows our emotions, He knows our reactions, what we're thinking, how we respond to things. And according to that, right, He just puts these attributes, He puts these one word just to kind of remind us that He knows what's going on. So, it's really amazing to see the Holy Quran kind of come to life. That's why it's important to reflect on these attributes. They're spread all throughout the Holy Quran. And if we really think about why Allah Ta'ala uses them, then it brings the Holy Quran to life. And what does that do in the long term? It then brings Allah Almighty to life for us. And that is really all that matters at the end of the day. So, one last thing before, we kind of wrap up this session. One thing that we always hear growing up, one of the ways to increase our spirituality is that we should adopt the attributes of Allah. It's taken from a verse of the Holy Quran, Sibghatullah, literally meaning that we should color ourselves in the color of Allah Almighty. And we hear this all the time, right? Adopt the attributes, adopt the attributes. So how exactly do we do this, right? What are the parameters of this expression?
Yeah. So, there's some names of Allah Almighty that, Hazrat Masih Maud Islam has said that they're transcendent, that we just can't adopt them at all. For example, Allah Almighty being Al-Ahad, the fundamentally unique. That the whole basis of that attribute is that it has nothing to do with creation. It is disconnected from it. And then there's other attributes that we can adopt, like the forgiving and the merciful. Then also in other places, Masih Maud Islam explained that there are some attributes that have no connection with creation and others that only come into application when creation is involved. So we have to understand also that a lot of these names of Allah Almighty, they're kind of a reflection of us as well. Otherwise, Allah Almighty is not limited to 99 names or anything. It's just the spectrum that we're able to experience. So when it comes to adopting the names of Allah Almighty, we have to just kind of see them individually. There's some names, like I said, we just can't adopt at all. And some where it's actually a negative thing to try and adopt those names. Like for example, Futuhat Makkiyah, Hazrat Ibn Arabi explained that, there's some names that are actually very negative if a person tries to adopt it, like Al-Jabbar and Al-Mutakabbir. Those are two names where anytime it's used for a human being, it's always in a negative connotation. There's never a positive connotation there because it's only for Allah Almighty to have those two attributes, to have those two names. And then there's others that can go both ways. Like, for example, in the Quran, it is said that the disbelievers will be condemned to hell, saying that taste the punishment because you thought you were Azizun Kareem in this world. You thought you were so mighty and so honored that now taste the result of those things that you did. So that's also an example where in Kareem, we see some people are named Kareem because Kareem, it has some good connotations, but it has negative connotations when done wrong. So those are some attributes where, we have to adopt the good aspect for human beings. And then there's others like, Ra'uf, the pitying, the compassionate, there's merciful, there's forgiving, there's the one who is just. All these different things, these are things that we should and we have to try and adopt within ourselves. So, we look at them one by one and just intuitively we know which ones we can adopt and which ones we can't. And then there's some in the gray area where it takes a bit more insight.
Yeah, and in the discussions of developing a love of Allah Almighty, Hazrat Masih Maud, mentions in his speeches that we should study the nature of love. Understand how we have love between human beings, a friend or mentor or spouse, what have you, and kind of have that same type of relationship with Allah Almighty, just how we make love, how we have a relationship of love with each other. We should do those same things with Allah Almighty. And one of the things is similarities, right? We develop a connection with people who are similar to us. If they're from the same place or they got the same interests, whatever, then there's just an automatic connection. So, in a way we have, just how you're saying, some attributes we share, but some we don't. So we have to share those attributes because it builds a similarity between us and Allah Almighty. There's a connection that we have something to build on. But of course, a relationship with Allah Almighty is not 50-50. He's Allah. He is superior. He's the master and creator of the heavens and the earth. So there are those attributes that we cannot fully, manifest in ourselves. And that's to remind ourselves that Allah Almighty is superior at the end of the day. Oftentimes in friendships or relationships, you might have this, frankness where it's kind of a 50-50, there's an equal respect going both ways, but we can't have that with Allah Almighty. We always have to be subservient to Him. So while we have those things that are similar, it's just for us to kind of build that connection. And then, but He has to be separate from us so that we have that awe of Allah Almighty. We end up worshiping Him. We end up becoming His abid, His worshippers, and His slaves. So it's interesting to see that relationship of love with Allah Almighty has got these two different colors. One is of similarity, but then also of separation at the same time. It's just a unique relationship.
Yeah.
But I think we've kind of reached the end of today's session. There's one question um, from Bilal Bhai. Where can we find a commentary on all the attributes of Allah? So just from my knowledge, I know that the Review of Religions started a series on the commentary on the attributes of Allah Almighty. This was when Masjid Mubarak was built, and they were just publishing small pieces. So you can find that commentary in of some attributes in that as well. I don't know if every attribute or majority of them were, if there was a commentary on them, but a good number of them. And then also, Huzur Tarab Aziz, again, Mabi Sahib, if you know, around 2007 or 8, he delivered a series of sermons on various attributes of Allah Almighty, and you can actually find those in the archives on Al-Islam as well. If you just search within the Friday sermons, that's just to my knowledge. Mabi Sahib, if you know any other resources.
Yeah, I mean, just exactly like you said. I think at the end of towards the end of Khilafat Rabia, if you look at the sermons, maybe from 2001 to 2003, then you'll find sermons on names of Allah. And then from I think around there were a couple in 2000, there were 2003, and then on and off, and then up until maybe 2008. When you look in those archives, you'll find a lot of names of Allah. It's not all of them; it's about 30 or so, but those names are covered. And then in the Review of Religions, I think they did finish that series. There they kind of took an approach where they would mention a verse of the Holy Quran that's somewhat related, then a kind of dictionary definition, then a hadith. Sometimes a hadith is related, sometimes a hadith actually doesn't mention that name at all. It just mentions a very general subject related to the name. And also then they would mention a quote of Hazrat Masih Maud, and sometimes the name would be mentioned in that quote. Sometimes it'll just be generally on that subject. So that's a structure that Review of Religion series took. So in the English language, mainly the summaries of those khutbat, which is maybe covers about, I would say, 20 to 30 names of Allah, and then that Review of Religions. I think in English, those are probably the only resources that are there, the resources that are most easily available.
Okay, Jazakallah. So I'm sure you guys have, are able to see the link of the quiz. That's part of our weekly, exercise. So, we'll just bring the session, kind of close. We'll have the quiz, and after that, we'll have the, concluding remarks as well. So if we can get that quiz up and started.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakallah Murabi Sahib. The quiz is open for all to join. Currently we have 14 or 13 players in. There are about 42 or 40 people in the webinar today. So we're requesting everyone to join, represent your region. The score will be based off of the total of all the participants in that region. So it looks like Midwest has the most Khuddam in. So I'm gonna wait a few more, give it a few more minutes, and then we'll start the quiz. So I will put the link in the chat again. There is also the QR code that is present on your screen. So you can scan that on your mobile devices and log into the quiz and represent your region. So I see some Khuddam are slowly trickling in. Again, the link is now in the chat, and you have the QR code that is present on your screen. Give it another couple of minutes and then we'll join. Go ahead and join and represent your region. It looks like Midwest has the most, alhamdulillah. See, Midwest has Murabi Sahib on their team, so I think Midwest might be the winner. Let's see, can we get a few more people on? Maybe 25? There are about 42 of us currently in the Zoom. So we got, looks like Midwest has the most representation today. Looks like Mogami finally has one on the board. Our headquarters is in Southwest, Southeast, East, Northwest, Gulf, Midwest, Great Lakes, and Virginia. Alrighty. We will begin the quiz. So the question will be based on the fastest answer. The first question is, what are the two main meanings of the attribute Al-Aziz? Is it might and justice, might and honor, or honor and grace? All right, there's about 5 seconds left. Go ahead and put in your answers if you haven't already done so. All right. So the answer was might and honor. Seems like a majority of us did that. Seems like Midwest is in the lead for total points, followed by Gulf and then Mogami. All right. The next question is, what are the two names of Allah that Al-Hakim is similar to? Is it Al-Alim, the all-knowing, Al-Hakam, the judge, and Al-Khaliq, the creator? Or is it Al-Alim, or Al-Hakam, and Al-Razak, or Al-Alim, Al-Shukr, Al-Khaliq? All right, 3 seconds left. And the answer was Al-Alim, Al-Hakam, and Al-Khaliq, the all-knowing, the judge, and the creator. It's like 21 of us got that right. Alhamdulillah. Let's see the leaderboard. Again, Midwest region taking the lead, followed by Gulf and Mogami. Seems like Great Lakes has bumped up, Virginia, East, and so on. Alhamdulillah, Midwest is going to take the lead. All right, what makes the name Al-Rauf, the compassionate, different from Al-Rahim, the merciful? Is it the focus in Al-Rauf, the compassionate, is on pity for someone who prays to God alone? The focus in Al-Rauf, which is the compassionate, is on pity for someone who repents after sinning, or is it on pity for someone who is suffering? So you have 3 answer choices. We have about 3 seconds left. And the correct answer about what makes the name Al-Rauf different from Al-Rahim is that the focus is on pity for someone who was suffering. Alhamdulillah, seems like Midwest, Gulf, and Mogami are keeping their spots, as well as Gulf, Great Lakes, Virginia, East, and so on. All right, there's 2 more questions. What was mentioned as the opposite of Aziz, which is the mighty? Is it Khalil, which is small, Zaif, which is weak, or Zalil, which is disgraced? Seems like we're almost there. All right. It's 5 seconds left. If you haven't put in your vote, it seems like everyone has. So what was mentioned as the opposite of Aziz, which is mighty, was Zalil, which is disgraced. 18 of us got that. And it seems like Midwest is going to stay. Gulf is now second, and Great Lakes is third, and Mogami has dropped, and Virginia has come up. All right, the last question is, can we adopt all the attributes of Allah Almighty? Yes or no question, 50-50 shot to gain some points for your region. So can we adopt all of the attributes of Allah Almighty? It seems like everyone voted, so we'll just go ahead and go to the next. All right. Alhamdulillah, it seems like Midwest has taken the lead with 3,067 points. Alhamdulillah to all of our Khudam in the Midwest region, followed by Gulf and then Great Lakes and Virginia. Seems like Mogami fell today. But Alhamdulillah, congratulations to our Midwest region. And go back to Marbisa, over to you.
You know, just to kind of wrap up in conclusion, the reason why we wanted to cover the attributes of Allah Almighty is, of course, we should know what the Holy Quran says, but we also should be aware of who is saying it and who is this author behind this teaching that is given us. As the Muslim very famously says that the Holy Quran is a letter that has been given to us. So we should know who wrote this letter, and that's what the attributes of Allah Ta'ala are there for. And the Holy Quran unpacks this definition of each of these attributes, that this is who our creator is. And just one kind of tip at the end, the Holy Prophet ﷺ has told us in a hadith that when we pray to Allah Almighty, then we should call out to him with his attributes. We should invoke those names where, you know, if we are in need of something, then, or if we're in some struggle, if we're in some specific situation, then try to use that attribute of Allah Almighty. Try to go through that door that relates to that scenario and that situation that you be in. And it makes that relationship with Allah Almighty a lot more personal, you know, like you're using his personal name or, you know, something, an attribute of his to invoke his, you know, his blessings and his mercy. So it's important to know who is it that is giving us this message in the Holy Quran. And we just went over 4 or 5 attributes, just 4 attributes today, and it became a whole session. So just think about everything else and how much that just opens up this understanding that Allah Almighty truly is infinite, and that the wisdom and the teachings in the Holy Quran, they themselves are also infinite. So if we let this go, then we'll never be able to tap into our ability to form this everlasting bond with Allah Almighty. Marbi, if you have anything left to say.
No, I think we, you know, definitely, you know, when we're going over each of the parts of Allah Almighty, a lot of these names of Allah Almighty do repeat. And as we know, you know, there is no verse of the Holy Quran that repeats, but it is a different context and a different aspect that's described. So these names of Allah Almighty have so many different angles that, you know, with each verse that they're mentioned in, that name becomes a reflection of the teachings that are found particularly in that verse. And the aspects of that attribute and the commentaries of that attribute are highlighted based on, you know, the specific teaching in that verse. So in this para of, you know, Surah Al-Baqarah that we're going over right now, those commandments that are mentioned that have to do with, you know, the different practices, even something as simple and as fundamental as the changing of the Qibla, you know, that's mentioned right at the beginning of that part, with the attributes of Ra'uf and Rahim being mentioned, of how people had such a sentimental attachment and how it became a trial for some people and all these different issues. So, you know, these names of Allah Almighty, later when the attributes of Ra'uf and Rahim come, and they're not mentioned in context of the Qibla in Surah Al-Baqarah, but with a different chapter, then they'll have a different understanding and aspect of Allah Ta'ala's compassion and mercy. So, you know, these names will come throughout the Holy Quran, but, you know, this second part of Surah Al-Baqarah, which we went over today, they have, you know, a unique application that, you know, we covered today.
Sound good. So I think, you know, we're good for today. Jazakallah for everyone who joined, and inshallah we will continue this. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.